In the winter of 1931 in Jarrow, County Durham, a miner's wife set a clay-coloured pot on the coal range and covered a mutton neck with cold water. No refrigerator, no packaging, no waste. That pot fed her family for 3 days, and the broth that came from it contained more calcium, collagen, zinc and glycine than anything a modern British family will eat in a week of supermarket shopping. Today, the average British household throws away £730 of food every year. The meals that prevented that waste and quietly sustained hearts, bones and guts across the most punishing decades in modern British history have been erased so completely that most people under 50 have never tasted them. The 14th meal on this list outperforms every convenience food on a modern supermarket shelf in nutritional density. The 7th was confirmed by nutritional scientists decades after it vanished from British kitchens. This is how it happened, and this is what was lost. Number 16 is pot barley broth, born in the South Wales mining valleys in the early 1930s, where a member of the Women's Cooperative Guild in the Rhondda Valley would set pot barley in cold water the night before, let it swell overnight in a cast-iron pot, and add a single marrow bone in the morning, nothing more, to feed 6 people across 2 full days. The bone cost almost nothing. The barley cost a few pence per pound. The pot itself was a household inheritance passed between generations, heavier than anything sold today, retaining heat long after the fire beneath it had been banked down for the night. Modern science now calls barley's beta-glucan the single most effective dietary compound for reducing LDL cholesterol. She had no name for what she was doing. She called it dinner. Number 15 is dripping toast, and this one requires understanding the enamel dripping pot. A squat, white-glazed vessel that sat on the cold larder shelf in a steelworker's kitchen in Attercliffe, Sheffield in 1932, collecting rendered beef fat skimmed from the Sunday joint each week. Every weekday morning, that fat was spread cold on thick-cut bread. The spreading was deliberate, careful, almost ceremonial. The crust pressed flat, the dripping worked into every corner, salted at the table. Nothing was added that cost money. The fat, declared a national enemy by health authorities in 1970, is now being quietly reconsidered by lipid researchers who cannot explain why the populations that ate it heavily showed lower rates of certain metabolic diseases than those who replaced it with margarine. Number 14 is peas pudding, and peas pudding cannot be understood without the muslin cloth. In Tyneside in 1933, a pork butcher's wife in the Newcastle area would tie split yellow peas into a muslin bag and drop it into the pot alongside a boiling ham hock, so the peas cooked in the ham's own liquid, absorbing its fat and salt and depth across 3 hours of steady heat. When pressed and cooled in an earthenware basin, the result became a solid, sliceable block that lasted days, eaten cold on bread or spooned beside broth. The resistant starch in cold peas pudding feeds gut bacteria in ways no modern probiotic supplement yet replicates. Number 13 is bread and scrape, and bread and scrape is exactly what the name says. A day-old loaf, a knife, and lard spread so thin it barely glistened, eaten standing at a Lancashire kitchen counter before a 5 o'clock shift in the cotton mills of Burnley or Accrington. The Rowntree Poverty Survey of 1936 documented family food budgets in which this constituted a weekday breakfast for months at a time. The slow fermentation in real lard, combined with the resistant starch of bread that had already aged a day, produced a satiety response that modern snack engineering has spent decades trying to replicate and has not achieved. Here is the first twist, and it is the hinge on which everything else turns. Every single one of these meals was born not from culinary tradition but from the arithmetic of scarcity. A Women's Cooperative Guild circular from the 1930s, a domestic science textbook used in London County Council schools, a household management manual from the war years. All of them encoded the same logic without naming it. The fewer resources a household had, the more nutritionally complete each meal became, because nothing was discarded and every part of every animal and every staling loaf was returned to the pot. Women in mining villages, mill towns, and coastal fishing communities were practicing what nutritional science would not describe for another 50 years. They were not cooking by instinct, they were engineering survival, one cold larder shelf at a time. Poverty accidentally produced health. Then abundance arrived, and the health disappeared with the poverty. Number 12 is spam fritters, which is where the pivot begins. In 1941, Ministry of Food recipe demonstrators Women employed by the government to travel between London and Birmingham teaching rationed households to cook showed housewives how to slice tinned meat, coat it in batter made from reserved dripping, and fry it in an iron skillet. A Ministry of Food column called Food Facts, published in newspapers between 1941 and 1944, promoted this exact technique across millions of households simultaneously. The fritter's protein-to-calorie ratio outperforms most modern fast food, though nobody was counting macros in 1942. What those demonstrators also understood, and what the column made plain, was that the batter crust served a second function. It stretched the meat so that one tin fed a family of 4 rather than 2. Economy built into the cooking method itself. Number 11 is faggots and peas, and faggots require caul fat, the lace-like membrane of fat that surrounds a pig's organs, wrapped around a dense mixture of minced liver, heart, onion, sage, and white breadcrumbs. In the Black Country in South Wales between 1938 and 1945, female pork shop owners and butchers' wives made faggots in batches, baking them until the caul self-basted the meat beneath it, the fat rendering slowly inward rather than escaping into the pan. A single faggot contained more B12, iron, and folate than a week's worth of modern multivitamin tablets. The caul fat is no longer available in most British supermarkets. You have to ask a specialist butcher who may not have it. Number 10 is oxtail stew, which in rural England in 1940 meant a butcher's wife in a Somerset or Shropshire market town setting oxtail joints, bay leaves and pearl barley into an earthenware casserole and placing it at the back of the coal range for 8 full hours. 8 hours. The kitchen filled with a smell that had no modern equivalent. Dense, mineral, animal, deeply savory in a way that no stock cube or processed concentrate has ever reproduced. The collagen in those joints dissolved entirely into the liquid. The gelatinous broth that resulted could be stretched across 3 separate meals. That same collagen is now sold in supplement capsules for £40 a month. Number 9 is bubble and squeak, and bubble and squeak was not a recipe, it was a domestic law. A domestic science teacher at a London County Council school in the 1930s taught her pupils that cold leftover mashed potato and cold leftover greens from the Sunday plate were to be combined without exception, pressed into a cast iron skillet heated with dripping and cooked until a dark crust formed beneath. Monday's meal cost nothing, not a penny of new expenditure. The reheated and repressed potato produces retrograde starch, a prebiotic that modern nutritionists now deliberately engineer into functional foods and market at considerable expense. She called it Monday's dinner. They call it innovation. Number 8 is tripe and onions, and tripe was bought pre-dressed from the specialist tripe dresser, a figure who occupied a specific and now vanished position in the food chain of Lancashire and Yorkshire in 1935. Bradford and Manchester both had active tripe trade directories. The Tripe Marketing Board promoted its product across the 1930s and 1950s through newspaper advertising and market stall demonstrations. Honeycomb tripe simmered in milk with sliced onion and nutmeg until silken, then brought together in a white sauce, provided caloric density without additional meat cost. Tripe contains more collagen, zinc, and selenium per 100 grams than any cut of muscle meat available in a modern supermarket. The tripe dresser is gone, the trade directory is gone, the knowledge of how to prepare it at home, which required specific technique and patience, is gone with them. Number 7 is stovies, which belonged to Scotland, specifically to Aberdeenshire and the Lowlands in the 1930s, where a Scottish Women's Rural Institute member would melt leftover beef dripping in an iron pot, add potatoes and onion and slow cook them until everything broke down into something dense and deeply savory, with scraps of Sunday roast disappearing into a new Monday meal entirely unlike the one it came from. The Scottish Women's Rural Institute kept recipe collections and regional circulars throughout this period, and stovies appeared in them without fanfare, listed between other Monday meals as simple domestic fact. The Scots magazine documented domestic columns throughout this period that treated stovies as unremarkable weekly fact. A 2019 survey of meals British schoolchildren could name did not include stovies, a dish that fed a nation, unrecognized in a generation. Here is the second twist. In the decade after the war, post-war prosperity and the NHS's early nutritional optimism arrived together, and with them came tinned processed meat, white sliced bread, and margarine, each promoted as an improvement, each backed by advertising budgets larger than anything the Depression kitchen had ever faced. A roll of cling film appeared on kitchen counters. A supermarket opened on the high street and stayed open 6 days a week, which the local butcher could not match. The domestic science classroom shifted its curriculum toward convenience and presentation, and the Depression meals, tripe, faggots, stovies, dripping, were reframed not as nutrition but as poverty, as something to be left behind. Number 6 is kedgeree, which by the 1930s had descended from imperial breakfast table to budget weekday meal. Made in Edinburgh and London by domestic servants turned housewives in reduced circumstances, combining leftover cooked rice with smoked haddock, specifically finnan haddie, cold smoked over peat, flaked and folded with a hard-boiled egg, curry powder and butter. 1 shilling's worth of smoked haddock fed 4 people as a hot breakfast. The smoke preserved the fish for days without refrigeration. Modern NHS nutritional assessments now describe the British diet as largely iodine deficient. Smoked haddock provided iodine at levels the modern British diet cannot match from any comparable affordable source. Number 5 is liver and bacon, promoted by the Ministry of Food in wartime pamphlets under headings that asked directly, "Why eat liver?" and answered with a list of nutrients, iron, B12, folate, that liver alone could deliver cheaply at a time when calf's or pig's liver was the cheapest cut in the butcher's window. Flash-fried with streaky bacon rashers and served with onion gravy and mashed potato, it provided in one plate what no combination of modern convenience foods replicates. Iron deficiency anemia in British women has increased substantially since liver left the weekly menu. The connection is not subtle. A generation of women stopped eating the one food that had reliably prevented a condition now treated with pharmaceutical supplements costing the NHS millions each year. Here is the third twist, and it is the final one. The larder was designed out of British housing. Council house floor plans drawn up through the 1960s and 1970s removed the north-facing larder shelf. Cool, dark, naturally ventilated, the thermal engine of every household trick in this list, and replaced it with a refrigerator space. By 1980, fewer than 1 in 8 British homes retained a functional larder. The domestic science curriculum dropped offal cookery, broth making and pulse preparation in the same decade. The knowledge was not replaced, it was simply not taught. A generation learned to open a packet, and when that generation grew up and had children of their own, there was nothing to pass on. The shelf was gone, the pot was gone. The vocabulary for what had once been done in those kitchens was gone entirely. Number 4 is dock pudding, and dock pudding belongs to the Lake District and the Yorkshire Dales, where a Cumbrian smallholder or farm wife in the Westmoreland region would gather broad-leaved dock leaves and young nettles at no cost from the field edges in spring, bind them with oatmeal and onion, and fry the result in dripping until firm and dark at the edges. The Westmoreland Gazette preserved recipes of this kind in its rural columns through the 1930s and 1940s. Dock and nettle contain more calcium per gram than milk. The nutritional logic of the poor was sounder than anyone in authority admitted at the time or has fully admitted since. Number 3 is spotted dick, which in the 1930s and 1950s appeared weekly in school canteens from Bradford to Birmingham, made by school cooks who combined suet with dried currants, self-raising flour and milk, steamed the result tightly wrapped in cloth for 2 full hours and served it dense and dark with custard. The steaming cloth was wrung out by hand, tied at both ends, lowered into boiling water, and left. The cook moved on to other tasks. The pudding looked after itself. Suet's slow fat release profile produces a glycemic response that modern dietitians deliberately mimic in low GI meal planning without naming the original. Number 2 is bread pudding, which reached its most rigorous form during bread rationing between 1946 and 1948, stricter in those post-war years than during the conflict itself. When a Women's Institute member would soak bread a minimum of 3 days, stale overnight in milk, then bind it with egg, suet or margarine, mixed spice, brown sugar and dried fruit, and bake it until set and pulling away from the sides of the tin. Bread that would have been discarded became a fortified meal. A Women's Institute circular from the 1940s recorded the technique with the same matter-of-fact precision applied to every other act of domestic preservation. Bread pudding made with 3-day stale bread carries a glycemic index 30 points lower than the same bread eaten fresh. The staleness was the medicine, And number 1, the crown case. The meal at the beginning and the end of this story is mutton broth made in Jarrow, County Durham in 1931, in the same kitchen where this documentary began. A mutton neck, the cheapest cut available, priced at a few pence in those years, covered in cold water in a coal-range pot, simmered for 6 hours, fat skimmed from the surface with a spoon, pot barley and turnip and leek added in the final hour, the bone mineral leaching slowly into the liquid across the whole of that long, low, patient heat. One pot fed a family for 3 days. The family that ate mutton broth 3 times a week in 1933 consumed more calcium, collagen, zinc and glycine than a modern family eating 3 times daily ever will. The medical officer's public health reports from Jarrow in that decade documented child malnutrition and rickets alongside the poverty statistics. But the children in households where broth remained on the range showed different outcomes. The broth was the difference. Nobody wrote a paper about it. Nobody needed to. The women who made it already knew. Now the pot sits on an empty shelf in a terraced house in Jarrow scheduled for conversion in 1974. The larder shelf was removed with everything else. The pot is cold. The fire beneath it is long out. No one recorded the recipe. No one thought it needed recording. The cloth that covered the broth is folded on the shelf beside the pot, still faintly damp, still carrying the smell of barley and bone. It will not be unfolded again.